That's us, Jason. Recording in progress.
We're doing it again.
We're doing it again. Yeah. This time, however, instead of a malt whiskey or a Kentucky bourbon or Indiana rye, we are talking about New York bourbon. Oh, that's the wrong sample bottle. That's the better sample bottle.
Flawless. That's not a sample bottle. This is a sample bottle.
Yeah, Jason, you and I actually, so the bottle that I picked up is my marriage bottle, because what we're talking about today is our Black Button bourbon, 5-year-old, and it's a marriage. Look at the color on that.
That's my marriage bottle over here.
Look at that. Okay.
Used to be a little bit higher, but I keep drinking away at it. So
this is the second blend that I made because I keep on drinking it. But you and I, Jason, and for our viewers here, have selected 4 Black Button bourbon barrels and married them together, and have since bottled them. We're going to be releasing this. This will be released on Thursday, July 14th. Is that correct?
11, 12, 13, 14. Yes, it is.
There you go.
Yes, it is. Yeah, there's a whole bunch of stories to be telling about this. First things first, I will say our One Nation Under Whiskey episode that dropped on July 13 is with Jason Barrett, the owner and master distiller at Black Button. And we had a lovely conversation. And one of the things, and many of the nation members already know this, one of the things for us when we approach a new distillery is to say, look, you do what you do, we do what we do. Do you have anything that will allow us to zig while you zag? And Black Button, and it is a conversation we don't normally have with people, had some 23-gallon casks. Regular listeners of the podcast, if you're hearing that in the background, a horse and buggy is going past my front door. My dog is going bananas. So huzzah. So we actually started having a conversation about 23-gallon barrels, which is not at all normal for us. One of the things we do like asking about is 53-gallon. So when the 23s came in, it was very interesting. They were doing something out of the ordinary. They're also doing something else out of the ordinary. Do you want to mention the yeast, Joshua?
Well, yeah, and I want to clarify one thing you said. You know, part of the reason we select 53-gallon barrels specifically for American whiskeys is simply that's where our taste, you know, our palate kind of prefers that larger barrel size. It's nothing to say smaller barrels don't necessarily produce a great product, but that's where our palate tends to align. So when we did see the 23, it kind of...
Well, and I think in the interest of full disclosure, when you talk about it aligning with our palate, one of the things we have found in the past is that the smaller barrels, smaller casks, can give some of that green quality. Like it smells young. It can smell youthful. And you know, a term we talk about in the podcast where we try to avoid using it in the that we try to avoid using in the pejorative is that it can smell crafty. And so en masse, we moved away from looking at smaller casks because on the whole, they tended to smell a bit crafty. So bringing it back to Black Button, these 23-gallon casks, we did not think smelled crafty in the slightest.
No, not one bit. And so I liked what you were teeing me up for. Like if you look at this, it says trial barrel, and the trial was actually, the yeast was a trial. So they're not using a standard bourbon yeast, you know, what everybody else would use. And I think that gets in part back to how they distill, which is wholly unique. And those who are watching this video, hopefully you'll have a chance to listen to the podcast and hear how they had to adjust their distillation style because of the equipment that they received 10 years ago when they built the distillery. But I found it fascinating that some of the samples that we got had the standard yeast that they use. And then they had these trial ones that said, trial bourbon yeast. We said, that's kind of weird. You're producing a bourbon without a bourbon yeast, but these trial ones are with bourbon yeast. What's going on? And it just gets back to the type of product they want to create. But they were also proud of these and wanted to show these to us. And
it makes me think a little bit, and you talk about non-traditional sizing with our Catoctin Creek, where it was 2 30-gallon casks of no cut Catoctin Creek rye, the only 2 being produced. This little trial with Black Button is the only trial going on that fits these parameters, that checks these boxes. Right. And so we are getting to share something with the nation that is wholly unique, a term that we don't like using. I know a number of our nation members don't like using, but in this instance, it is accurate. This is an incredibly unique trial that they ran at the distillery in 2016, a long time ago.
And it allows us to do something that is our remit, right? Show people a side of a distillery that they may not be familiar with, right? That's what independent bottlers typically have. That's their job. So anyway, all of that out of the way. These are 4 barrels or 4 casks, I should say. The cask size is not barrel in size. But
it's the fact that when we call them small barrels. Nope, it's a small cask. Barrel still means something. So that nose.
Well, what I love about this nose off the bat, and you and I talked about this on the podcast a little bit.
Mm-hmm. I like your use of a little bit.
Is that the oak at no point in time does the oak overtake the grain, yet at the same time, the oak just frames the grain so beautifully. So you get that, there's no doubt about it, right? You get some of those traditional bourbon-y flavors going on with the vanilla and the caramel and some of that coconut spice going on, or oak spice and a bit of toasted coconut. But behind that, you're getting a lot of the grain influence that I really like. What are you getting? Well, you talk about the palate, and then I'll go. I'll go to the next.
Actually, just when you talk about that grain, can you give us the 4 grain?
Yeah.
Give the breakdown here, because I think this is important.
Yeah. This is good. So the mash bill and I like this, right? They're perfectly transparent about their mash bill. 60% corn, 20% wheat, 11% malted barley, and 9% rye. And I want to add on to this as well, something that Jason Barrett had mentioned in the interview. So all of these grains are from like their farm, right? Local farms. And where they are in Rochester, it's a glacial area. So you've got, I think he said it's around 400 feet of topsoil available to these farms for growing the grains. So you have these real big, plump grains providing a lot of fermentable sugars, providing a lot of flavor coming in. So, and this gets back to what I was saying before, the fact that the oak isn't overtaking the grain, you get to actually experience some of that's going on.
Well, it's a point that we made in talking about the Virginia Distillery Company with our VDC, with their spirit still coming through a Spanish oak maturation with Oloroso and Pedro Jimenez. And it remains something we're always looking for, is spirit character. And again, if you put this in front of me blind and said this was 23-gallon maturation, I would not believe you, because there's just not. Sorry, I'm still working through that cough. There's just not that overwhelming presence of the oak that you get from smaller casks.
there's a dried cherry note coming through here that is just supported by a load of black pepper, just ground up black pepper, which is so nice.
But there's a chocolate note going on as well, where I think one of the necessary things to do with this black button is to put it next to the backwoods and have a look at the chocolate cherry in the backwoods next to the chocolate and dried cherry note in the backwoods, in the black button. I knew I was going to screw that up.
Oh my gosh.
You speak.
Okay. So the texture up front, right? And you and I talk about this all the time. Someone had asked us when we were in Chicago doing our live podcast recording, someone had said, what texture do you really go for? I mean, I'd said I like a nice oily texture, but with that kind of nervousness, that slight effervescent quality coming through. And this has that in spades. But once you get beyond that texture, it's anisette cookies, right? Those Italian sort of almond cookies going on. It's gingerbread and custard and maraschino cherries. And it's just dense, but it's all that densely flavored. I'm not saying it's like this bourbon, but I'm saying it's delivering flavor in the way that this does. In the same way, like George T. Stagg, anybody's watching this, if you've had George T. Stagg, what's nice about that bourbon is it's delivering to you a load of flavor in a really dense manner. And this is doing the same as that.
The part that's really capturing my attention right now is that there's a pleasing drying quality to this. And when you and I recorded the tasting notes as part of the podcast, that's a little bit of a surprise, spoiler alert. That was on an afternoon. Mm-hmm. And I didn't find it quite as drying as I'd found it when we'd written the tasting notes. This morning, recording this with you, I'm getting more of that drying quality going on. And I think one of the things we always talk about is, when are you tasting? How are you tasting? With whom are you tasting, right? Mm-hmm. And to have something from Black Button that can change depending on when you're drinking it, that can change depending on what you're drinking around it. I think is always so fascinating. I don't think there's a right or a wrong to it. And I'm not finding it unpleasantly drying. And it's certainly not as drying as the VDC with that big Spanish oak presence, right? And I didn't find the VDC unpleasant either. No. It was just, it had big drying notes across the palate. This has some drying notes across the palate. How did you find the backwoods for drying quality?
I'm not talking about backwoods right now. I want to talk Black Button here. Listen, you talk about all the drying, and I want to be really clear to our viewers here, because we brought this up in the past. We brought this up when we released our 24-year-old pre-fire Kentucky bourbon. And our biggest fear was that 24 years in cask would make this so drying, it would be astringent and puckering. Yeah. And I have a problem with bourbons over 8 years old sometimes, because there's too much oak going on. And it goes from pleasant drying to an astringency, and from it being more oak than anything, right? And in this case, is that pleasant drying quality that you got on the VDC, right? That I'm getting here, but it's just the right amount, and it's never overtaking the grains. And so I really want to highlight that we really are like astringophobes. So with that in mind, back to your question about backwoods, there is a similarity between this Black Button and the backwoods, in that I think the oak and the grain are living harmoniously together in both bottlings. This, when you mentioned it in the podcast, this really is a Joshua and Jason pick. Like there's something about this that, you know, at all times when we bottle bourbon, we want to bottle really good bourbon. And that's what we do. We look for good bourbon, we bottle it. In this case, this seems like something that we would actively seek out. And I would argue we tried a few different recipes, right? A few different cask marriages to see what we could create from the various samples we got from Black Button. And I would say what we created here is very much a Joshua and Jason bottling.
Yeah, as I mentioned earlier, if you gave it to me and told me it was 23 gallons, I would be very surprised on the maturation. If you gave it to me blind and said this was selected by Jason and Joshua or Joshua and Jason, I would be like, yep, that makes sense. Yep, I buy that.
So listen, because we have to close it out here.
Very quickly on the finish.
Very quickly. The finish. Oh, go ahead.
Right, just slowly drying. Fades away over here. Nice little bit of the grain component left. A little bit of the pepper. A little bit of cinnamon, maybe.
That's
like cinnamon. A warm cinnamon.
But it's not the hot cinnamon. It's the warm, like put it on your cappuccino kind of cinnamon.
Yeah.
So this, like we said before, is going to go on sale Thursday, July 14th. There's about 400 bottles overall from the casks, plural, and it's going to be $90 a bottle. Buy 2, buy 3 if you want. There's enough bottles, and you'll benefit from $10 flat rate shipping fee.
Yeah. No, I think the fact that our backwoods, however many bottles, 280, 300, I can't remember what was on the label there. The fact they sold out in 48 hours, I think anybody who supported that bottling, please line up, support the Black Button bottling as well. This New York 4-grain bourbon is really cracking. Really good drinker. At 56.1% alcohol. I don't know if you mentioned that.
I did. I don't know if I did, but the last thing I'll say about it is this will sit perfectly and proudly next to any of the wild turkeys we've done. The Jubilee Heaven Hill we did back in 2012, 2013, whatever it was. Any of the bourbons, it'll sit loud and proud. So cheers to you, Jason.
Cheers to you, Joshua, and cheers to Black Button.
Cheers to Black Button, and cheers to the viewer and to our nation members.
Cheers.